Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to the Honest Youth Pastor YouTube channel, the channel that helps believers use biblical discernment in all aspects of life. We just recently made a video where we have started going through Matthew, the book of Matthew, and looking at how to read our Bible, right? Nothing real deep, not getting into a lot of word study, not really digging deep into a lot of the things that come up, but just using Matthew as a basic way to teach people how to read the Bible. We already did chapter 1. If you want to look at Matthew chapter 1, kind of the study we did there, we'll leave either a tag up top or it will definitely be linked in the description below. The idea here again, and I just want to make sure you know this going in. If you already know how to read your Bible, if you already know how to study your Bible, this video just frankly isn't for you. This is for the new believer or somebody that has never been taught how to read the Bible and wants to get into the basics. Obviously, there's lots of people to teach you how to do that far better than I, but here's my little way to do that via the internet and the platform that I do have. So that being said, we've already done Matthew chapter 1. I want to jump into Matthew chapter 2. This particular app that I'm using, I will link it below along with a couple other links that you can check out if you want to further your Bible study. But this is the ESV digital journal, and you can download it for $15 after you sign up for a Crossway account. Not affiliated with Crossway, but I found this is a really good tool. Now, we've already covered in Matthew chapter 1, the big summary is that Matthew's point, he wants you to know that Jesus is the Messiah. Right? He is the promise from the covenant of Abraham. He is the promised Messiah, the one that come through David's line. There is no question that he is the Christ. And he was born of a virgin, and he's very careful in the last part. See, here's some of my notes from last time. He's very careful in the last part to make sure he connects a prophecy from Isaiah to Jesus and make sure that they know that Jesus is not the son of Joseph. He was conceived by the Holy Spirit. So that's sort of the foundation as we go into Matthew chapter 2. So here we go. Matthew chapter 2 says this. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah in the day of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. A few things here. Again, like I said in the first video, and like I will continue to say over and over again, we need to look for context clues in the text. I know this is basic reading comprehension, but one of the things I think that we do is, especially with the scripture, is we just read it and we just throw reading comprehension right out the window. There's a few things that Matthew's pointing out specifically that help us as modern believers understand what he's doing. Now, in the first one, he's already said, okay, Jesus has now been born. He's been born in Bethlehem of Judah, which is important because, again, Bethlehem is part of kind of what Matthew is going to use here to point out the prophecy of Jesus being the Messiah and what's going on as far as even historically. That's a question you could look up. Historically, how does Bethlehem play within the Jewish people's history? So that's something you want to. He's very careful to say, hey, Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judah, and not only that, he's born in the day of Herod the king. Now, this is where sometimes looking into history, historical context, really, really helps. It always generally helps, but Herod the king is general in speaking about Herod the king. There's lots of Herods that rule within the time before and a little bit after Jesus. And so looking into the history of the rulership, especially the Herods, the family of the Herods, is going to be really, really helpful. Now he tells us that after this happens, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? This is very important. The wise men from the east are coming asking about the King of the Jews, and they're asking Herod the king about this. Now, this is important. Herod, again, contextually, I don't want to get like a lot into it because this is sort of the thing that you would be asking. Who is Herod, right? That would be one of the questions that you would be looking up so that you could sort of delve more into this. But the point is, King Herod, in this sense, is very paranoid about his kingdom, even about his sons taking over his kingdom. And so when the wise men come asking about the King of the Jews, this is already setting Herod off. And Matthew is specifically saying, hey, King of the Jews, this is the question they're asking. For we saw the star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now, this is something here. Again, we're not going to get into it, basic Bible study, but you would want to look up about worship. What do they mean by worship him? When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled. Now, again, this is something you'd find out whenever you look it up, but the fact that King Herod is troubled is not just troubled because it's the king of the Jews, but there's something a little bit deeper. And he says, Matthew says, and all of Jerusalem with him, and the assembly of all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where this Christ was to be born. And they told him, Bethlehem of Judah, for so it is written by the prophet. Now, here's something very interesting. These are wise men from the east. And according to at least how the ESV has it here, and this is why you would want to consult the original languages, other translations, but according to the ESV, it is they told, so it's the wise men told him being Herod, quotation, in Bethlehem of Judah, so it is written by the prophet. So these wise men from the east are aware of Jewish prophecy. It says, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means the least of the rulers of Judah, and from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, a couple things happen. Matthew's careful, like I said, to mention Bethlehem at the beginning of chapter 2. The wise men from the east here are referencing a Jewish prophet in regards to who Jesus is, and Matthew includes that as well. Herod hears this, and he summons the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he said to them, and he sent them rather to Bethlehem, saying, Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I too may come worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they saw a child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. So I said before, you needed to let's look into the word worship. What does it mean that they're worshiping him? Because there's two worships that are mentioned here. One by King Herod, which is, we're going to find out, obviously, that's a false worship. And then a worship of the wise men from the east that have they at least know some Jewish prophecy, and they come and they worship him. And that's true worship. They're coming and they fall before him. Then opening up their treasures, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, of myrrh. If you've been in church very long, you've already heard this before, but I would do research and ask, okay, well, what are these gifts? How much are they worth? Why would they have brought them? You're going to find a lot of different varieties of reasoning, but that's the question you want to ask. Again, these are the things that, especially the chapter 2, if you've been in church at all, or even if you're just visited church on Christmas and Easter, this is a story you've heard, and it's probably a story that's sort of old to you and you already know it, so you're not asking the right questions about it. But things like that, gold, frankincense, myrrh, what's the importance here? Why did these wise men from the east know of a prophecy of the Jews? Are they Jewish? Why did they fall down and worship him? These are all questions that as we're reading this, Matthew's put it here for a reason. Why did he put it here, right? Now, verse 12, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their own country by another way. This is something we want to pull out. Now, again, I know depending on your background within the church, denomination, theological training, this may be different for you, right? As far as how you're going to take this. Joseph has already been talked to in a dream not to divorce Mary. These wise men from the east are warned in a dream not to return to Herod. So at least within the New Testament, in the Gospel of Matthew, we've been shown twice that God has come to people in dreams to warn them, in this case, not to do something that they were going to do otherwise. If we are aware of the Old Testament, what happens there, God regularly comes to people in dreams and tells them to do or not to do things. And Matthew, as a Jew, is just carrying on this tradition. If a Jew is reading this, they're not going to be incredibly surprised, at least if they're familiar with the Old Testament, of an angel coming and telling people things in dreams. God does this to pagan kings in the Old Testament as well. This is even within any Eastern traditions, this is a fairly common thing of the gods talking to people in dreams. And so we see this here again. The wise men have a dream not to return to Herod, and so they depart another way. Matthew doesn't tell us if they talked about it, anything like that. Just this is what happens. Now, that was Jesus' birth, and the gifts being given. So within the first chapter already, from chapter 1, we've seen that Jesus is the Christ. He's the covenant, the Messiah through the covenant, the Messiah through David the king. He is born of a virgin. This is the Christ. We see after his birth, people come and worship him as the Christ, as this Messiah, in fulfillment of, again, yet another prophecy that we see there that Matthew points out that the wise men from the east talk about. And so again, just so we're clear, Matthew from the very beginning is just pounding over and over again this point. Jesus is the Messiah. He is worshiped. He is the Christ. Now we have in verse 13, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. So again, we have one more time an angel coming in a dream and telling them what to do. He says, rise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child and destroy him. And he rose and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. Now here's what's really interesting. And this, again, we're not going to dig in, but this is a question that you would ask. Okay, when did Herod die? Matthew's very specific in giving us these sort of context clues to say, well, Herod was king here. This is the time frame that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Hey, Joseph and Mary and Jesus stayed in Egypt until then when Herod died. And so this is something that it gives us. Matthew is building us a very loose time frame, but a time frame nonetheless, because you can look up when Herod died. You have documentation from Rome about that, because he was at this point, Herod was a governor-esque of Rome, because they had taken over Jerusalem and Israel at this point, and they put him into rule. It's a very interesting story if you look it up. Now, Matthew is also not going to leave out that, hey, yeah, this is when they return from Egypt, when Herod dies, but he points again to prophecy. He says, this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. Now, one of the things that's really interesting here is that Matthew is continually pointing to prophecy. And that's something we need to understand. Matthew does this on purpose because he is writing to a Jewish audience. Now, we may not know that when we're just approaching the Gospel of Matthew. Maybe one of the questions that should come up for us, if we're not aware of that, is why is Matthew continually mentioning Old Testament prophecy? Why is that important to him? Because it clearly is. He's done it at least 4 times in the first 2 chapters alone. So why? Well, it's because he's talking to a Jewish audience, and for them, this Old Testament prophecy is incredibly important. It points to this Christ they've been waiting for, this Messiah they've been waiting for. And he comes out of the gate strong with that by talking about Abraham and David, but he's just reinforcing that as he's working through here and talking about, hey, the prophet said this, the prophet said that, the prophet said this, and Jesus is the fulfillment of these prophecies. And so we see that he's even tying in them having to be run away to Egypt as the providence of God fulfilling a prophecy at the exact same time. So yes, they had to flee, but God already knew they would have to flee because he prophesied that they would return. And so Matthew is quoting this as a fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, he's sort of skipping around on the timeline because obviously in this last verse, he said, they come back after Herod's death, but we're going to jump back. Matthew says in verse 16, it says, then Herod, so he's still alive. This is after they fled. Then Herod, when he saw he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious. Now, this is interesting. Again, this is, if you were to actually look up Herod, you would see there's a lot of paranoia. There's a lot of power tripping that he does historically. And so this became a furious thing. Matthew's just giving us an indication, obviously, not only of his temperament, but if we were to understand the context and the history, like this is his character. And he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Now, here's something that's interesting before we get to verse 17. Historically, we don't have an account of this, and you would find that out, right? So some people, if you were to research this passage, you would find that like people would be like, there's no account of this child massacre happening in Bethlehem. Matthew seems to mention this again for the reason of fulfillment of prophecy, not as a sort of fact check sort of situation. He has a purpose in mentioning this, and it seems to be in verse 17 when he says, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah," and he quotes Jeremiah. Matthew seems to only include this portion because he wants them to know Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. This is also a fulfillment of the prophecy. This seems to be the only reason he includes it at all, which also seems to be why Matthew includes a lot of the things he includes to point out, hey, this is Jesus the Christ. Hey, this is fulfillment of prophecy, which will help us, I think, if we understand that and we're diligently seeing a pattern here, because when we look at the other Gospels, they don't do this. And so why doesn't, for example, John or Mark do what Matthew's doing here and mention the virgin birth and mention the massacre in Bethlehem? Like, why do they not do that? Well, their purpose is different. Matthew's purpose seems to be to tell his fellow Jewish people that with a huge, big pointing sign, Jesus fulfills prophecy, Jesus fulfills prophecy, Jesus fulfills prophecy. And so in every point that he's made so far, and you can see the pattern, is that this thing happened, it fulfilled prophecy. This thing happened, this fulfilled prophecy, which seems to be the intent of why he even tells us about this. Why don't we have a historical account about it? Well, again, you could look into it. I think Bruce Gore gives a really good explanation in regards to the fact that Bethlehem is not a big city. And if that were to have happened, there may not have even been an account of it. There's a lot of things that weren't accounted for. You can say that's a good reason, a bad reason. It doesn't really matter. That's not Matthew's point here in writing it, is to say this happened, it fulfilled prophecy, and it fits in with the rest of sort of his flow of thought. Now, he goes back to sort of where he left off before talking about Bethlehem and the children being killed. And he says, "But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the child and his mother, and go back to the land of Israel, for those who have sought the child's life are dead." So what's really interesting is that Matthew is very particular. He tells us about Herod's death twice. He also includes, again, this idea that the angel of the Lord appears to them in a dream. But he also tells us this, and we can kind of pick it up. I don't know if it's his intent, but we kind of pick up the thing that, like, he waits till Herod dies. It's not that we wait a couple years afterwards, and then we just kind of, Joseph and Mary and Jesus could have kind of just moved back. But the angel of the Lord does not tell Joseph to return from Egypt to Israel until after Herod is dead, which is an interesting just little factoid for me, because it seems like, I mean, the one that sought the child's life is dead. He's just waiting. God just waits till Herod is completely dead, and then he sends them back. And so Joseph is faithful. There's not a questioning. Anytime Joseph has had an angel appear to him in a dream, he just does what the angel says. And so verse 21, "And he rose and took the child and his mother and went back to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in the city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, and he would be called a Nazarene." So here's something really interesting. And again, this is just not reading over things, but just looking for sort of context clues. The angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream and tells him to go back to Israel. He doesn't tell him where to go back. He just says, go back to Israel. And so he's going back to the land of Israel. Apparently, Joseph's assumption is he just needs to go back to maybe Bethlehem or Judea. But as he goes back to Judea, he hears that Herod's son is ruling over that place, and he was afraid. Joseph was afraid that the son was ruling again. So he's going back to Israel like he was told. The angel didn't tell him where to go back. Joseph just assumes apparently it's Bethlehem, Judah, that area. And so when he's going back, he's on his way back, he's scared. And so the angel comes again and tells him to go to Galilee. And so this Matthew also is very particular about. In setting up this story, the angel tells him to go back to Israel. Joseph is going back. He hears who's rolling over a particular area of Israel in Judah. He's scared, and so an angel gives clarification on where to go, and he goes to Galilee. And in that clarification, Matthew says, well, actually, where Joseph, Mary, and Jesus go, he ends up being called a Nazarene, and that is also a fulfillment of prophecy, that he would be called a Nazarene. So Matthew, in just the first 2 chapters, has done a few different things for us that I think is really important. The first being that he's shown us, again, that Jesus is the Christ, but how does that practically play out within the life of Mary, Joseph, and Jesus? Well, the wise men come to give gifts and worship baby Jesus. And we're not talking about just like, oh, this might be the guy. Like, they bow down and give alms, essentially. They give gifts to Jesus. King Herod, an earthly king, is paranoid about Jesus being called King of the Jews. And again, there's contextual and historical things there about the Jewish uprising. And there's a lot of tension contextually that you can look into that. But there's a reason that he has the reaction that he does. And that's a super interesting story that you can look into. And we get that from how Matthew writes. So Joseph, Mary, and Jesus go to Egypt. Matthew says that's a fulfillment of prophecy. King Herod, in his paranoia and lust for power, kills all the babies under 2. Matthew says that's a fulfillment of prophecy. Joseph and Mary come back because the angel tells them to come back after Herod's dead in a dream, and in a dream and then a follow-up dream exactly where to go. And Matthew says where they went is a fulfillment of prophecy. And so Matthew, within the first 2 chapters, has done some really interesting things for us as the reader. He said Jesus is the Christ from the covenant of Abraham through the line of David. He is the promised one born of a virgin, and all of these things that happened to him are fulfillment of prophecy to prove that he is the Christ. And we get all of that just in the first 2 chapters of Matthew. That's pretty amazing if you think about it, because Matthew is laying the groundwork for everything else he's going to talk about in the 20 plus chapters we have left. And I think you're going to find this is incredibly interesting when you slow down, look at the details and the context clues of what's happening that are written. And I think the scriptures will come even more alive to you than they are just when we look at these particular words, when you start looking at the actual context and culture of Herod, the context and culture of the time, all the political dynamics that are happening around it. All of those things bring the Bible alive in a way that it probably hasn't been brought alive before to you, and that even shows that try to depict it are going to fail at doing because they're missing the exact words that the author of this particular gospel, Matthew, is giving us to paint this wonderful picture that this Jesus you're about to hear about is not just another person, but he is the Messiah. He is the promised one. And Matthew's going to lay that out in the following chapters. And I hope you join us for those times as well. If you found this helpful, leave a like. If you think somebody would benefit from this, share it with them, and we'll talk to you later.